Hello, hello. Today on English Extras, I am very happy to introduce a really cool guest. Joining us today is Ben. Ben and I met in early 2025 in a content creation boot camp hosted by Joe Franco. When I met Ben for the first time, he mentioned he had been a linguist in the US Army, specifically for Arabic, which is a notoriously difficult language for native English speakers to learn. And I was instantly intrigued. He has now transitioned back into civilian life, and he's bringing that linguistic passion and expertise to YouTube as a content creator, helping people learn and grow their languages and documenting his own journey learning his fifth language, Vietnamese. You should definitely check out Ben's YouTube channel, and there's a link in the description for you. Today, he has kindly agreed to satisfy my curiosity about how he learned Arabic and how he's currently learning Vietnamese. So, Ben, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
I would love it if you could introduce yourself and especially let us know more about your language background because I know Arabic isn't your only language.
Yes. So my name's Ben. I was born and raised in Arizona, so I'm a native English speaker. But I also learned Spanish, Arabic, Italian, and Vietnamese. Spanish was the first language that I fell in love with. I first started taking Spanish classes in junior high school, and I took them throughout high school as well. But it wasn't until my Costa Rican neighbors moved in and I started trying to speak Spanish with them that I really fell in love with language learning and foreign cultures. So, like, after school and on the weekends, I'd go hang out with them and practice Spanish and learn more about Costa Rican culture. And after I graduated from high school, I joined the US Army. And after basic training, they sent me to the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California to learn Levantine Arabic. And I was there for about a year and a half. And after I graduated, the army sent me to northern Italy to be stationed there. And I lived in Italy for about 3 years. And the moment I got there, I started studying Italian because I was like, if I'm going to live in a foreign country, I really would like to learn the language because I want to like speak and connect with the people there. And so, yeah, right away, anytime on the weekends I would go out, I would try to speak Italian with people. And yeah, I honed my Italian while I was living there. And then about 10 months ago, I started learning Vietnamese as I was transitioning out of the army. I was actually able to go to Vietnam back in May and did like 3 weeks of immersion there. And that was super great. And now I feel like my Vietnamese is at the point where I can have like very basic conversational language with people. And yeah, that's kind of been my language learning journey so far.
Fantastic. I've been burning with curiosity about how the army trained you in Arabic because I'd imagine that you were held to pretty high standards in that regard. I'd guess that there wouldn't be a lot of room for error. So, could you give us an overview, but also feel free to be specific where you like, of what that teaching or training looked like?
Yeah, so specifically the Levantine Arabic course, it was about 16 months long. I guess how the kind of the daily schedule went was we'd be in class for 6 hours a day, and we'd also get 1 hour for lunch. About 2 to 3 hours was reading practice, 2 to 3 hours was listening practice, and then an hour of speaking practice a day. We also had like monthly unit tests, so if you didn't do well on the last unit test, you'd have to stay for an additional seventh hour, is what they called it. And then after language training, we would have to go back to our unit and then do physical fitness training with our unit. And then after that, I usually had about an hour to an hour and a half of homework. The Arabic teachers were really nice. They didn't give us like a ton of homework. Yeah, and then I went to bed and restarted the whole thing for 16 months straight. Yeah. And then at the end of the course, we take a test called the DLPT, which is short for the Defense Language Proficiency Test. And that's the test that all military linguists use to gauge their reading and listening comprehension. And it's on a scale from 1 to 3. And you need a 2 to pass. And then for the speaking test, it's called the OPI, which is short for Oral Proficiency Interview. A lot of civilian organizations and companies use this as well. And for that one, you only need a 1+ to pass. And it's also on a scale of 1 to 3. Technically extends to 5, but no one I knew at DLI, the Defense Language Institute, got higher than a 3. So, which is kind of crazy to reduce language down to like a single digit number. But that's like how the Army likes to like quantify language ability.
I think we definitely see this in academic circles as well, where they like to quantify it down to a number, but it's so impossible to really do that with language. I always say that language is more art than science. I don't have data to back this up, but I would guess that most of my audience learned a little bit of English in school, and languages in general are often just a subject in the classroom. And I think you and I both know that learning a language in the classroom is not always the best way to prepare you for using that language in the real world. How did that play out for you with Arabic? Did you feel prepared when you actually had to use the language?
Honestly, I don't think like after graduating from DLI, I don't think I was completely ready. I felt like my reading and my listening comprehension were okay at best, but speaking, I don't feel like I was ready in that sense. I mean, part of it was because I did go to DLI during COVID, so the first 2/3 of my course were completely online, which made the speaking aspect of learning the language like a lot more difficult to pick up. But I also feel like compared to like a traditional university or a traditional high school where you're learning a language, I think DLI in terms of the teaching and the curriculum is better, but also the sheer amount of hours that you're putting in, like you're probably putting in like 7+ hours of language learning, studying per day. So I think because of the volume, it is also better than in a traditional sense. At the same time, like, I mean, speaking is huge because the way people talk on the street and how people like talk normally with one another is a lot different than how textbooks are, and even like how people on the news or on camera will speak.
Did you ever run into other dialects of Arabic? Because I know there's different, like vastly different dialects. Like there's Egyptian Arabic, and you learned specifically Levantine Arabic. Was it one of those circumstances where you were able to understand some or most of other dialects, or was it completely incomprehensible?
Yeah, actually, I did ended up studying and taking other dialects because the army they actually give you bonus pay for knowing certain languages. And luckily, a lot of the Arabic dialects were one of those. Most of them were paid languages. So I ended up studying and taking other tests to get my proficiency in other Arabic dialects. And there were also instances where I did interact with people from that did speak other Arabic dialects as well. What I would say is that like I think the closer geographically the dialect is spoken, the more it is easier for me to understand. For example, as a Levantine speaker, I can understand if an Egyptian or an Iraqi speaker or even a Yemeni speaker were trying to speak to me, I would get the gist of what they're saying. I wouldn't pick up like everything, like not as well as Levantine. It'd still be like intelligible. I can comprehend what they're trying to communicate to me. But when it came to dialects that are like further away from the Levant geographically, like Algerian, Tunisian, Moroccan, those ones, yeah, I have no idea what they're saying. Like it was a complete gibberish. Like I could not pick up anything at all.
Interesting. I imagine it might be similar if someone learning English is used to learning the American accent, but then tries to understand like Scottish, like a Scottish accent.
Yeah, I feel like that example is tough because I feel like in the US we speak like very more simply. I've noticed we speak more simply than like British people do. They use like I feel like they use like higher level vocab, and they're more. I guess their accent is a bit more sophisticated than ours.
That's definitely the perception I think that a lot of Americans have. I'm really curious, did you have any of those moments I've heard bilingual people talk about where you have that bilingual moment, like bi like BYE, where you kind of forget your native language and your target language and you're just kind of blank?
I've had, I definitely had those kind of moments. I've had moments where I'll forget like English words and I'll only know the word in another language, or if I'm even if I'm speaking another language, like either Spanish or Italian or whichever one, I'll remember the words from the other languages, but not the one that I'm trying to speak, and it's funny but frustrating at the same time.
Absolutely. Now you're moving on to Vietnamese. I actually already know the answer to this because I watch your YouTube videos, but can you tell our listeners why you've decided to tackle a deliciously difficult language like Vietnamese?
Yeah, the main reason is, I mean, there are a lot of reasons, but the main reason is family. My mom's side of the family, they speak primarily Vietnamese. Although my mom speaks English really well, a lot of the times we don't have to communicate in Vietnamese, but nowadays I make her speak to me in Vietnamese so I can get the practice. But also, I also just love the food, the people, the culture. And Vietnam is a very beautiful country. And on top of that, the language I find to be a lot of fun. The grammar is pretty straightforward, but the pronunciation is what really makes Vietnamese a difficult language in my opinion. It has six tones. The tones and the pronunciation in general is kind of like a large barrier to go through at the beginning of learning the language, but once you get the pronunciation down, it's all like downhill from there. It really just becomes a game of building vocabulary. Yeah, and I've been having a lot of fun with it.
I'm so glad to hear that. And that's actually a really great segue into my last question. What methods are you using to learn Vietnamese? And follow-up question, how are your current methods influenced by what you or how you learned your previous languages?
Yeah, so currently I kind of have three different study plans. So for 4 days a week, I do a lesson with this app called Learn Vietnamese with Annie. And it's basically a Vietnamese language course that's co taught by Annie, who's a native Vietnamese speaker, and Jack, who's a native English speaker. Basically, it's just an audio lesson that runs you through an audio passage and explains the vocab and everything behind it. And so I do that. I do one lesson about 3 to 4 days a week. And after the lesson is over, I like to write down 12 of the most useful vocabulary words that I learned from that lesson. Another day during the week, on Sundays, I call my mom for 30 minutes to do speaking practice. And on Mondays, I like to, what I do is I take the vocab lists I made from all those previous lessons from the previous week, and I'll input it into Quizlet to make flashcards, and I'll study those flashcards for that day. That way, I'm reviewing all the most useful vocab that I learned from the previous week. That process has really helped me get, on one hand, apply the language through the lessons and through speaking with my mom, and then also build vocabulary on top of that. So I can continue to expand my base vocabulary and also prioritize the words that are the most important. And as to how like my method is influenced by my previous language learning, I think it's most influenced by learning Arabic because this is what I did the same thing while I was at the Defense Language Institute and while I was studying the language on my own after that. Anytime I did like a study session or anytime I had class, that night I would have my journal of all the new vocab words I learned, and I just took the top 10 most useful ones, and I would make sure to save them. And then when it was the end of the week, I would turn them, like I'm doing with Vietnamese, into flashcards. And I would review those flashcards because the way I view language learning now is it's really, once you get past like learning the pronunciation and the grammar, it really becomes a game of applying the language and building your vocab. I guess that's how I view language learning now, as a very like two-pronged approach. And I go like more detail into like the whole process in one of my videos called How to Learn Languages Faster. So if anyone's curious as to like how to do my method step by step, I go more in depth in it in that video.
Fantastic. That's so good. One last question. A lot of my audience, their biggest concern is speaking and improving their speaking. And they might be able to listen to anything and understand, but that speaking part is still really weak. So, do you have any kind of actionable advice to that specific concern?
Yeah, I used to struggle the same thing with Arabic. I talked about it before, how like my speaking wasn't all that great compared to like my reading and my listening comprehension. I think the biggest thing for me was really putting in the reps and doing it consistently. After I had graduated, I noticed my speaking was just like really not at the level where I needed to be. And so for like the years afterward, I would just meet with the language instructor, the Arabic language instructor we had on base, every week, and we would just practice speaking like every week. And I would just practice talking to her, and that was just the main thing and the main focus. And yeah, just putting in the reps. And if you're like very like shy and introverted like I am, and you're like afraid to like try to speak with people in other languages, I think the best advice I could give is just like really just try to put yourself out there, and accepting that learning or making mistakes while learning languages is not only okay but necessary to learn. So yeah, I would just throw yourself out there. And if you are able to immerse yourself by traveling to the country where that language is spoken, that's just another great way to just force that language out of you.
Absolutely fantastic. Well, Ben, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your insights and advice. We really, really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun.